Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast, where hope matters. I'm Jimmy Hinton.
And I'm Clara Hinton, and we're so glad that you've joined us.
If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Well, thanks again for joining us for this episode. The last week we were talking about whenever Mom and I reported Dad to the police. And so this episode, we're talking about the storm after the calm. Because really, reporting to the police, that was the calm part. We didn't know it at the time, but that was actually calm compared to what was about to follow. So, you know, as Mom and I were talking in preparation for this episode, we were saying that, you know, one of the things that was really devastating for us was how many unknowns there were. At the point that we walked into the police station, there was no guarantee that there was even going to be a full-blown investigation. I mean, we didn't know anything at that point except that we had gone in, we had reported, and our lives as we knew them were about to change.
Right. And when I think about just stepping into that police station, you're so right, Jimmy. Everything was unknown. We had never done anything like this before. We didn't know anybody who had done, reported something like this. So the world that we were about to enter was totally a brand new world. And it was a mighty scary one at that.
Yeah. But I think people need to understand too, you know, I've been to multiple trainings before on abuse, and, you know, it's usually they have law enforcement talk about it, but it can be people who are professionals in advocacy organizations, but they just say things like, well, if you see something, report it. If you see something, report it. Or if you see something, say something. Well, what they don't talk about in those trainings is it completely turns your world upside down, especially if you're reporting somebody who's a family member. And so, some of the unknowns that we had waded through, here were some of the questions that I had, and I'm sure you had a million other questions.
Yeah, right.
When's he going to be arrested? Or will he be arrested? Every day seemed like 1,000 years. Just waiting for him. Are they going to arrest him? Do they have enough evidence to arrest him?
We were walking on eggshells. We really were, not knowing what was going to happen. And furthermore, what was this arrest going to look like? Mm-hmm. I mean, what is an arrest? How's that happen?
Yeah. Where do they get it?
Yeah.
Do they arrest them at work? Do
right.
they,
right.
do they bust into the home? All these questions. I really agonized over, will he find out who reported him?
Right.
Once he was arrested, I didn't care as much. But that was in, my safety and your safety mm-hmm. was certainly at the forefront of my mind. If he finds out that we reported him, I mean, this changes his life as he knows it too.
Well, that's another
thing. And I worried,
thing.
Is he going to kill us?
Right. We did not know how he was going to react. As difficult as it was for us to believe the truth, it was equally as difficult for us to say, we don't know him anymore. Mm-hmm. How will he react? He was always kind and gentle and soft-spoken. Your dad was not a man of temper or anger. But here now we know there's this dark side, this other person. Who is he? Mm-hmm. And that's another thing.
And what's he capable of?
Right.
If he's capable of that.
Right.
Is he capable of homicide?
Absolutely. And that might sound silly to some, but if you stop and think about it, when you've grown up in a home and you've loved and, adored this person called father, and he's been your spiritual leader. He's been your husband. He's been that person you look up to. Suddenly you find out he's been molesting children. You don't know what to believe anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You absolutely don't.
Well, another one, kind of a flip side to that, is he going to find out we reported him? Is he going to try to kill us? Strangely, there was an equal burden of hoping that nobody tries to kill him. And, it's for a number of reasons. One, at the end of the day, and as strange as this sounds, he was still my father. And at the very beginning stages of that became a very powerful emotional component. At this point, I'm able to kind of separate that out and say, yes, he's my father, but he's a horrible, horrible, horrible person who did these horrible things.
I was going to say, Jimmy, how do you separate that in the very beginning? It has taken years now to work on that, and you and all of the kids, myself, I don't think we have that fully separated yet.
Mm-mm.
Not yet. And at this point, your dad was your dad. He was your mentor. And now you've found out this terrible truth and you've reported it. And I think there's that feeling of you being a betrayer also. And I don't know how much you worried about this, but I worried that your dad would commit suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I was worried about that. And then I thought, how will you and the rest of the family live with that?
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't know where this was going to go.
Well, then I thought about too, because I actually remember you calling me and saying that one of my siblings was on his way.
Oh yeah,
from out of town,
yes.
And he actually vowed to kill him.
He did.
And so I was thinking, not only, okay, now my dad's going to get killed, but my brother's going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Well, I had to warn him. This is after Jimmy and I went through the task of telling each of the children. This is after one of his brothers said, I'm coming to kill Dad. I'm going to kill him.
I still remember that phone call when you called me.
Oh, how well I remember that. And I kept calling him back and saying, don't you dare get in your car and drive out here. He said, too late. I'm on my way. I'm going to hide in the bushes. I'm going to wait for him. I'm going to kill him with my bare hands. I'm going to kill him. And I called the police and alerted them. I asked them to go look for my son's car. As weird as that sounds, too, there were a lot of crazy things happening, one right after another. And I thought the same thing. Here now I'll have a son sitting in prison for murder, murdering his own father. So
I just remember too, you and I being highly anxious because we're like, what is taking them so long to arrest him?
Right.
He had already given a statement. He had already confessed to victims. He had been served no contact order with minors. And we're like, what in the world is taking so long for them to arrest him?
Why don't you explain what took so long? What were they, and it keeps, when people contact me, I always say the police are looking for hard evidence. They don't want to know just a little, I think that he's doing weird things or she's doing something strange with children. Well, hard evidence. Yeah. They wanted something
And I
concrete.
think that's important, too, for people to realize, because one of the assumptions, especially in the religious community, is that, there are all these cops who are just, as soon as they hear one side of any story, they just go and arrest people. And we need to make sure, that these poor guys aren't being arrested unjustly. And I'm telling you, it takes a lot for somebody to be arrested. By the time somebody's arrested, they know,
right.
And there is enough
right.
evidence, and they're going to make good and sure that there's enough evidence to make an arrest. And I remember the father of the victims that he was arrested on, when the detective showed up to his house to tell him that his daughters had been molested. Do you remember what he said? She Detective Beckner said, he asked the question, "Are you sure?
Oh,
Are you
yeah,
sure that
yeah,
it's with my
yes.
daughters?" And she said, "I'm not here on a." How did she put it? I'm not here
her exact words.
on a might or something like that. I'm here on a know-how.
Yeah, and
so she said, "This is certain." So by that time,
absolutely
they had
certain,
confiscated his devices that had the images on, and they knew beyond the shadow of a doubt. So even when they report it, let family members know, they've gathered enough evidence by that point. I think that's really important for people to know that.
For us, I remember making multiple phone calls to the police as well as to the district attorney's office saying, what's happening? What's going on? Because you and I were walking on, it was like anxiety. I don't know, just anxiety times 1,000, wondering, when is this going to happen? We wanted to be prepared a little bit.
Yeah.
I know I did. Because there again, what's going to happen once the media knows, once our community knows? We had a very few people at this point that knew your dad was under investigation even.
Yeah.
We couldn't go around saying anything.
My wife and I had told, it was about probably five people or so, from church. We had pulled a very small, hand-selected group of people, and by that point he hadn't been arrested yet. And we said, we want to tell other people so that you can help us walk the church through the aftermath of this. He will be arrested. We said we can't reveal any details. All we can tell you is that he's about to be arrested on suspicion of child abuse, and we have it on good authority that this is not a mistake, that he in fact did, because we wanted to make that message clear that there is evidence that he did this, so that church people wouldn't be like, oh, well, what can we do to support your dad, and how do we stand behind him? We wanted them to know he's going to be arrested, and it's on founded charges.
It seems like, Jimmy, just hearing you recount that one episode out of many, many, many days that we traveled this journey up until the arrest, it's like a nightmare yet. My stomach is churning. I feel sick. I feel anxious just talking about it, because at that point, you and I and we had disclosed to the kids and the family, and that's about it. But we were all suffering. And there was nobody for a support, because nobody that we knew had walked this road before.
Yeah. And
they didn't know what to tell us or how to help us, except, and I was so happy that you did that you chose just a few solid, good friends from church to stand by you and your wife. And I did the same thing at work. I told the 3 employees that I work with, I'll never forget sitting down to tell them, and they were just, their mouths fell to the floor. They were just in shock. But they were there. And I think that's important for people to understand, to set up some kind of a support system while you're going through this, no matter how small or how weak you think that support system is. It's important, because those few people really did help us when push came to shove.
Now, some of the other unknowns, I was worried, will he show up to church? And I'm going to say it was it was less than 3 weeks from the time we reported until he was arrested.
Right. Yeah.
So it was a short time period, but 3 weeks it feels like an eternity when you have all this stuff that's up in the air, because I was now planning, my wife and I had drafted a statement that I actually ended up reading to the church once he was arrested. And so, we had sat down and drafted that, and it's literally like planning for a funeral that is coming. Only it's worse than a funeral. So, that was a big question. Is he going to show up to church? when do we tell the family? After we walked out of the police station, I remember that conversation well. And you were the one who finally said, I think that, you need to call certain siblings of yours and, because they'll receive it better from you than they will from me. And we were just in uncharted territory.
We split the kids down the middle. You call this one, I'll call this one.
We literally assigned siblings of mine between you and I. We made assignments.
I think we were in such shock at that point because I don't even remember exactly what I said. I remember some of the reactions, aside from I'm going to kill him, vomiting. Some of them ran, threw the phone down and ran and had to literally vomit. And keep in mind, all of our family is not intact in our little county, our little town where we live. We had in, several different states. And it's hard when you're not face to face and you can't put your arm around and say, I have some awful news to share with you. It was, I would never want to live through that again or do things that same way. I think it was awful. It was just awful. I think if I had my druthers, I'd rather have somebody by my side, and same for you, with us, kind of holding us up. It was just, I never felt that empty and low before in all my life. And same for you, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, then, we struggled with, I remember Natalie and I having conversations. When do we tell the church? When the whole congregation, we had drafted a statement together that I was going to read, before the church. And we said, okay, when do we do it? And so I actually had worked out with the detective. I said, I want a phone call the second you arrest him, because, we knew once he was arrested, it was going to be in the newspaper.
Right.
And so the church was going to find out one way or the other. I wanted them to hear it from me before they found it in the newspaper. So then, the next unknown, what do you say? How do you put that into words? And keep in mind, he preached at the church where I'm preaching now for 27 years.
That's what I was going to say. I wanted you to really emphasize that again. It wasn't just any church and it wasn't just any group. These were people that grew up with your dad. They grew up with you. These were family to all of us. These people they really were family. And they loved your dad. So the hurt that we had felt is now going to be placed on the church once you tell them as a collective and individual group.
So I remember, I don't know, it was a few days after you and I had reported, I got a phone call from the detective, and she said, I just wanted you to know, your dad just left the police station. She said, I called him in for questioning, and she said, you just need to brace yourself. She said, Jimmy, it's really bad. And she said, there are a lot of victims, and what he did to those little girls, he said, it's very bad, and you and your family need to brace. And she said, right now your family's going to look to you, and you need to be the one who prepares them. And she said, you probably can be expecting a phone call from your dad because he still doesn't know that you reported him, and he knows he's going to get arrested at some point. And so no sooner she hung up, my phone rings and it was him, and my heart it absolutely sunk. And I answered it, and he said, I need you to come over, and I need you to talk to me. He said, there's something I need to get off my chest. And so I said, is everything okay? And he said, no. He said, he just kept saying over and over, and he was really incoherent at that point. And he said, I'm screwed. I'm screwed. He's like, my life is over. He said, I really messed up, and you need to come over and you need to talk to me. And so Yeah, I'll share that for another time, what that conversation was like. But, it's just these back-to-back things that happened.
I think the emotions that you were going through, Jimmy, I remember you calling me and saying, Dad called, and I'm going to go over and talk to him. And you knew that things were bad at this point, and I cannot imagine being you were young, you are young, having that heavy of a burden on your heart. Your dad, who you loved and adored, now that whole image of your dad has been destroyed. It's been broken into so many pieces. And you have a church that you're caring for. You have a family, a wife who is married to you, and she's going through all these emotions with you. You have the rest of your extended family. I don't know.
And a church family. I mean, we had a church it's a small church, but nonetheless, you have 100 people that you're caring for. And,
right.
And,
that's no little thing.
You're nurturing. And I still remember, because you just have people, and anybody in ministry knows this. You constantly, not one week goes by where you don't get multiple calls from people who are going through their own stuff.
Right.
And, at that time, I remember thinking, I have to pretend like I actually care about their,
right.
Their problem, which is not a problem at all. And, it was, to them it was, but in my mind, I was like, they have no idea what problems are.
Your whole life was shattered. Your whole everything had been destroyed. And yet you had to somehow keep it together. Mm-hmm. And some people are probably thinking, well, why? Why didn't Jimmy just cave? You couldn't. Mm-mm. You could not at that point.
Not until he was arrested.
Right.
Until he was arrested.
That was so critical for you to keep it together. Mm-hmm. And it was not easy.
No.
Not at all. And were after shock waves after that you'll discuss later on. But this was a critical point in your life, I believe. Really.
No, for all of us. Yeah.
I think people, you need to understand too how some of this came about. John had taken a part-time job at our local Walmart. He worked in the meat department. And I remember the day that he was working, and one of the detectives went in and talked to him at work. And I know, Jimmy, you and I would talk together often, and the detective stayed, and the police department stayed in close contact with us.
They were very good.
They were wonderful.
At keeping in touch with us. They kept us constantly informed.
Which, again, is something that is not the norm. Mm-mm. Everybody doesn't have this kind of support. And I think we both thank God over and over many times about that. We live in a small community. People knew us, and they were wonderful about that part. But then what was hard was your dad would call you and let you know this was going on. Mm-hmm. You became his confidant in all of this. And I remember you talking to me, and you sounded at that point so empty. Like, what do I do? I reported Dad. Dad's leaning on me for support. Mm-hmm. What if Dad finds out? And it was this constant turmoil. I don't know how you breathed through that. I really do not. Your dad at that point was telling you how, he was under investigation, and, his life was going to be ruined and all. And he's not knowing, of course, that you were the one that knew all this other information. But he also kept saying, I need to hire a good attorney. If only I could get somebody to help me out of this. And I remember he got in touch with one of your other brothers, who he called me And he said, what is going on with Dad for real? Dad said he really didn't do anything that big. If he only got a good attorney, he's going to ask somebody from church to give him some money to hire a really high-powered attorney, and he could get out of this. And I remember another statement your dad made, that it was, if this had happened in any other place other than the U.S.
Yeah, he told me that.
Yeah.
Yep. He said if what I had done had been in any other country, he said it wouldn't be a big deal. But we live, and I remember he said, we live in this stupid country where they make a big deal out of nothing. And, he was actually, he was visibly irritated. And I knew at that point that he's a sick man.
Right. Because you had heard from the police, out of your dad's mouth, they had gotten confession what he had done. They also now had his computer and his phone and had the hard evidence that they needed. It wasn't hearsay. It was truth. So that was just a jumbled up nightmare and every day that turned another 24 hours with another 24 hours of nightmares. Absolute nightmares.
Well, I remember, I think we can probably close with the phone calls, and whenever he did get arrested. And so, I didn't keep a journal. I know you did, but I do remember it was a weekend that he was arrested. And I think it was on a Friday. It was either Friday or Saturday, but I think it was a Friday. And I remember the detective, she called me up and she said, I just called Sam, who was over at the other church, 1 block over from us, because he had victims in that church and he had victims in our church. And she said, I just called Sam, and I'm calling you. She said, this is the Sunday for you guys to tell your churches. Because Sam and I had coordinated too. So not only was I coordinating with the police department, I was coordinating with the other minister at the other church. And so, while I was reading my statement to my church, Sam was reading a statement to his church. And it was just this nightmare of a moment. I remember it was part relief. And it's just there's so many emotions that were polar opposites throughout this whole process.
Well, I think there was relief in knowing that your dad would be arrested, and finally we would be able to talk about it freely. We couldn't talk about this and get any kind of real support. But then comes the whole community is going to know now, the church and the whole community, and we'll save that for next time. It's like, how do you face people?
It was just back to back, because now it was in a matter of 3 weeks. Now the whole church knows. She had told me that on Monday, this would be in the newspaper. And it was. So then, literally the next day you go from, okay, now we have to tell our whole church family. And I worried about gossip. So I actually wrote into my statement, I said, I will not tolerate anybody who talks about this without talking to my wife and I first. And I said, and there's no question that's off the table, because I knew in every parent's eyes, and I saw it when I read my statement, in every parent's eyes, they were wondering, and from old to young, was my child one of his victims? Absolutely.
And, oh gosh, that whole thing, we will address all that next time, I'm thinking, but just talking about it is enough to make us tremble. And Jimmy, you especially, having to stand up in a public way and read that statement about your father, I think...
It's humiliating.
That was another thing. There is shame. There's an element of such shame. Why didn't I see this? Why didn't I know? How could this be my dad? Same for me. As I was married to this man. He's the father of all of my children. There's this, I was once this proud preacher's wife. Now there's shame, just so ashamed, embarrassed.
And I think we both felt like we let
Grieved.
tons of people down.
Yes,
because
I did.
You carry that burden in a strange way. I thought all these, there were kids in my congregation who were abused under my watch.
Right.
And
you feel responsible.
Yeah, and I
as
felt
a parent feels for their child responsible, you were feeling that same responsibility for your church.
Mm-hmm.
And for my children are now all broken. They, and I was broken in a different way than you, but I felt like I should have protected all of you better. I didn't know this man. Right under my roof. This man was living a double life. But anyway, we will, I think that's enough for one session here. We basically wanted to walk you through a little bit of what it's like when you're waiting. You've told now you're dealing with the police. You have reported you're waiting for that arrest. Mm-hmm. And many times, as Jimmy said, it doesn't turn out to be an arrest, but they're looking for hard evidence. The hard evidence was found, and we'll talk more about it next time.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize, and we're actually going to do a whole episode dedicated to this in the near future, but because I think it's definitely worth addressing. And I know you get emails all the time. I get them all the time. They say, well, yeah, that was nice that you guys reported and he was arrested and is now spending the rest of his life in prison. But what about me? I reported my husband for abusing my own kids. Not only was he not arrested, but he sued and got full custody of the very kids that he was abusing. And so I would say more often than not, that's more likely to happen than what happened with us.
And we'll talk about why.
Yeah. Right, and so as horrible as all this sounds, we're not looking for a pity party. We're just, we're kind of sharing how we processed through all this. And how everyone will process the finding out part. I mean, that it's, But as horrible as it was and as bad as it sounds, we're not complaining because we literally had the best case scenario. We did. Absolutely. I without doubt, God was with us all the way, every step of the way. So we'll end with our truth bomb. And this message is for people who are friends or in social circles of people whenever a predator is arrested. So for the family members of that sexual predator, here's what I would say for their friends. Be a friend to that family and don't be strange. Don't be weird. Don't give them a pity party and act all bizarre. Just be a support system for that family. They might not look like it. I think on the outside, we probably did pretty good at faking like we were okay, but we weren't. That's how we were anything but okay. Shock and trauma works. Yeah. Right. So just be a friend. Be a friend to the family members of predators whenever they're arrested, because it is hell on that family. It's awful. It is. So thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next episode. As always, thank you for tuning in to the Speaking Out on Abuse podcast with Jimmy and Clara Hinton. You can subscribe to the podcast through either of our websites, findingahealingplace.com, jimmyhinton.org, or through iTunes. Please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode.